right. So tonight is what should have been last week's lesson, Sumer, but Ararat got in the way. And I don't know about you guys, but I enjoyed the heck out of that. I never really fully appreciated the city and culture of Ararat, and a lot of my sources don't really give it any kind of time. They just jump right into Sumer. So I think in some ways we're actually doing a little bit better than some of the sources that came out as late as the early 2000s. So that's the nice thing about science, is it's always improving and is constantly learning more for us to share. And in this, there's a lot of things I don't like about the internet, but what I do like about it, other than helping to give me a job, is that information gets shared out quicker and quicker. Sometimes before it's fully baked, but we can take that into consideration. And so tonight we'll be looking at a number of Sumerian cities. There's a lot of them. We'll look at Sumer because Sumer is probably the best analogy for the world we live in today. Believe it or not, the first civilization, we've come full circle. The first civilization and our civilization have a lot in common, a whole lot in common. And I hope to point that out as we go. But a lot of what it has in common is also negative and has lessons for us. We're thankful for that. For whatever reason, the Lord did not see fit to put a whole lot of Sumer in the Bible. But there's a lot of Bible in Sumer, which is interesting. So we're going to look at that. We'll look at the first word out of the scriptures to set the tone here. Look at our sources, same as last week. We'll look at some maps, look at the Sumerians. If I listed everything we were going to look at tonight, it would fill the screen, and that's ugly. So that said, we'll start with Genesis 15:7, because we've been beating the heck out of the verses in chapters 10 and 11. But this is God talking to Abram about the time he's going to make him Abraham. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. Now, he's talking about Canaan, but at the same time, God acknowledges here and in a number of places that he brought Abram out of this place. And my presumption is that he used this place to create the kind of person that Abram was. We see a lot of people in the Bible who are pagans. Nebuchadnezzar is my favorite. And every time he witnesses an amazing miracle of God's power, he says, the God of these guys is amazing. Everyone should love no one should ever say anything negative about their God. Now I'm gonna go back and talk to my other gods. You know, it's not till God made him crazy and threw him out into the wilderness for a while that he started to recognize, oh, that's right, there is only one God. But that's the problem, and it's been the problem even in the development of Christianity, is helping unbelievers to realize he's not another God to add to your pantheon. He's the only God. And you don't need your pantheon anymore. And that is a difficult point to make to the polytheistic, pantheistic world. And guess what? It's the one we live in right now too, okay? Now, only there's not 1,000 gods like Sumer. There's 7 billion gods in this world, one for each of us, right? Because in our world, you are God. So that said, sources are pretty much the same. Yeah, pretty much. I probably could have taken a few out because we're out of the Ubaid and we're into the Sumerian. So I have 2 very good books on that. And then there's a lot of online sources as well. But again, they're still trying to catch up. The book I had was waving around last week, The Sumerians, by Noah Kramer. Boy, does he gets quoted all over the internet. And you're reading this stuff and you go, that sounds familiar to me. And you realize it's quoting him from 1973. Updated in 2000. So he's still considered the guy. And it's because of his work as a junior archaeologist back in the day, and then becoming the senior guy, and then the fount of all wisdom when the folks who were his mentors died, and So he really is the source. He discovered a lot of this, especially when it comes to the cuneiform and the writing. He discovered a lot of it himself and his teams. So he really speaks from authority. He's not quoting someone else's work. But we get right into the Sumerians. Just to give you an idea where we are, we're at about 6,500 years ago, right? To add 2,000 to 4,500, and so the early biblical scholars, theologians, they looked at this and said, "Oh, these are the pre-flood people, or these are the very post-flood people." But because the world almost seems to decrease in its sophistication after the Sumerians, a lot of what I call Christian sources place the Sumerians before the flood, and they say that's the reason God destroyed the world. Those people couldn't get along. With all we've studied over the last 2 quarters, we know that is not the case, and actually can't be the case. But you'll see it definitely rings. It rhymes with what we study in the Bible. They are the earliest known civilization. And by that we mean the sophistication of roles in the society, fully stratified. You got a king, and you've got a peasant, and in the middle you've got all kinds of classes of people, and to a degree even maybe castes of people. So that stratified society is what makes something a civilization. Along with that, that comes out of specialization. So there's people who do the same thing all day long. Until the Ubaid period, that didn't really exist at all. Everybody did everything. Some people might have been better at certain things, but they still had to grind their bread every day. So they didn't have somebody doing that for them. When we get to the Sumerians, we get into absolute stratification. We have schools, we have universities, we have full-time government workers, we have full-time farmers, full-time potters. And so that's going to, in addition to the issues of stratification, right? One person being more important than another, we're also going to get people of different skill levels as well. And that's going to go into how people think about themselves and how they think about each other. It's not a nation per se. If you ask the people in this Sumerian city and that Sumerian city, Sumeria and Lagash, what are you people? What kind of, and they'd say first, they're citizens of Lagash. Then they'd say they were Sumerian. They probably wouldn't have used that word. They had a different word for it, but they would have used a word that we would translate to Sumerian. But their local identity was more important than their national identity. They really didn't have a national identity. They had a cultural identity. Think of like us, the US and Europe, right? Maybe Great Britain. We fought them twice. These people are fighting each other all the time, and they have very much the same culture. But as we said last week, this is right out of last week's slides, it is a conglomeration of 3 different cultures: the first farmers, the first metallurgists, and by metallurgy is stretching a little bit, and then the pottery people, the people with the cool pottery who figure out some important things about how to kiln fire clay and additives. There's really a lot of cities, and these are cities, they're not just little towns. These are thousands of people living in each one of these. Probably all or most of them have walls around the city, and they have trade relations, and they have border guards and the like. So from here to about here is Sumer proper. This is an area that the Sumerians interfaced with, but it would become known as Akkad, and they're very important. So Sumer is the home team. Akkad is the Canada, if you will. The Gutians and the Elamites are like the Russians and the Chinese. Okay? Rivals. They are our rivals. Because they're not as sophisticated, these are way not as sophisticated, these a bit less. This is going to become the Persian Empire eventually. These guys over here. This is going to become the Parthians, maybe. So they're going to figure in history later. But they were a plague on these folks. But you think with this concentration of people and technology and everything we're going to talk about tonight, that they could just take over those folks in no time at all. But no, they actually lived in dreaded fear of them because most of their time was spent being rivals to each other. So really didn't get it together. When we study Egypt next week, we're going to see how something like this becomes one. It all comes together as one true nation. So there's no nations here. There's just cities. Some of the cities are big and they control the land around them. Not just like a Jericho where you control what's inside the walls. It's significantly more than that. And some of these cities are enormous, as you'll see. But they took over for where the Ubaidians, the Ararat2s, who are still, they're still there. They're down, let's see, they're about here. So, so that's and Ararat2 is going to be right about here. But already, you know, in the Sumerian world, is the place and Ararat2 is important, but it's a port city. Other cities are important in here. I don't know why they pointed out just Ur. Ur was the capital for a time, and Ur will be where Abraham comes out of. But here's what happens with that trade network, right? Last week with the Ararat2s, it was largely about pottery. They're taking their sailboats, they're bringing stuff that they don't have. They get a lot more sophisticated during the Sumerian time. Not only do we have pretty metals, we start to bring in things that we can really use that there's absolutely none of here. And it literally will stretch from the Mediterranean and up to the Caspian Sea. So, you know, almost into Northern Europe, and it'll go all the way to Afghanistan and through the coast here, it goes to India, to the Indus River civilization. So it helps seed those folks too. And depending on who you read, they also sail around this way, around the Arabian Peninsula, and come up here where they influence Egyptian culture. So because Sumer predates Egypt as a civilization, and the Egyptians do it very differently, but they clearly have everything that the Sumerians did first. And in a world like this, the idea that two things get created independently at around the same time that look kind of the same, unlikely. If the Chinese do it, that's something else, right? You've got a certain amount of isolation. But if you're trading with the Afghanis for lapis, lapis, I think it's lazuli is the second word, but lapis is the only beautiful blue mineral and people love it. And the Bible's full of lapis, lapis, lapis. One of the foundations, I think, in the New Jerusalem when it comes down out of the sky is lapis. You know, I mean, God loves lapis. Clearly, everybody loves lapis. It's gorgeous. It only comes from Afghanistan in this world, and so they're dying to have it. But as you can see, they're going to be the Caspian Sea has all its kind of all of its products. The Persian Gulf is going to take you around Africa, the Horn of Africa, all their products. India is going to have spices. These people, this is globalization 1.0, okay? This is really, really good. So you've got Europe, Africa, and Asia all happening in real time, boats continuously going in and out of ports, taking what, and think of Sumer as kind of the finished goods place because they were the ones who were mass producing. And we'll see that in the Inventions in a little bit. But this trade network really is what gave Sumer its sophistication and building upon what they'd done with nothing but, what was it? Clay, marshy clay, reeds, and water. What they built out of that became very valuable to everybody else. And so everybody else's valuables ended up in their world, and their cities reflected cultures and products from all over the world. But Sumer is mentioned in the Bible not many times, considering what a big role they played in civilization. The absence of Sumer is one of those things that makes us scratch our heads, and it also gives the anti-Christian faction a very loud question to ask. We know that Noah's son Shem, that actually translated into Sumer. That was Noah Kramer's discovery in Akkadian. We read this verse like twice last week and once the week before. So we know that Shinar is also considered to be Akkadian and Hebrew for Sumer, and Akkad is mentioned as well, and Erech. You know, all these cities we know about. This is actually Ararat2, of course. But so, you know, the cities are getting mentioned in the Bible. And those neighbors who we talked about, right? The Canadians and the rivals, Elam, Amorite, Hittite, they're all mentioned in the Bible prominently. They survived Sumer. The Hittites actually come a little later, so do the Amorites. But Elam's there through the whole Old Testament. And of course, Abram hails from Ur of the Chaldees, and that is Chaldeans actually, which is Ur take 3. So Ur 3.0 is when Ur finally gets to be capital city again at the very end of the Sumerian world. And it's amazing to think that a civilization that existed for 2,500 years was lost to the sands of time until 1848, when we started to find it. And when Noah Kramer was writing in the early 70s, he was still, people didn't still fully understand. And even some of the online resources today referred to the Sumerians as Babylonians, which are the people that come significantly later, at the very, very end. So a 2,500 year civilization just disappeared. And it was so eclipsed by those that came after it that they were largely forgotten. Although the cities they founded, especially Babylon, went on for, you know, other empires that followed. But there are Bible stories in the Sumerian publications on those little clay tablets, and they're really close. They're really close. The fall of man exists in the book of Adapa. Noah is in their world Ziusudra, and they can point to when he was and where he came from. Job in their world is known as Taba Utu Bel in the New York Times bestseller Man and His God for the time. And we also see a lot of wisdom literature like our Ecclesiastes and a lot of Lamentations, as we see in Jeremiah and the book of Lamentations, around similar things. Now, of course, Jeremiah was talking about the fall of Jerusalem. Jerusalem wouldn't come along for thousands of years. And Ecclesiastes is Solomon that comes along about 1,000 or in the late 900s BC. And so we're thousands of years. But the point is that a fair amount of the Bible stories sound to the modern ear like Hebrew adaptions of Sumerian mythology. That's cool. That's cool. And we're going to address that at the very end. But when I look at this, I don't see the Hebrews copying the Sumerians. What I see when I look at this is all of Noah's sons knew what the truth was, but there was no writing. Everything was oral. And so as the generations go on and on, hundreds of years become thousands of years, the stories take on a different character. What color is our Jesus in all our pictures, right? And how close is that to the original? But of course we have the Christmas song, right? Some children see him, right? And all the different verses for all the different colors of the rainbow. But that's what happens is the stories take on a local flavor. The stories take on your culture, your idea of what's right and wrong. And we even see that in the difference between Judaism and Christianity, right? That are cheek to jowl. One fulfills the other. Don't ask the Jews if they feel that Christianity fulfills their Messiah prophecy, right? Not for most. And so that, to me, that's what I'm seeing. So I look at the fact that the Bible stories that Noah gives us in Genesis and so on, the fact that they so closely resemble this, I like that idea because Noah is going to be a product. I'm sorry, I said Noah. Moses is a product of Egypt and Sumer, right? Sumer through the line that comes down from Abraham, and the Egyptians, as you know, we're not giving anything away. We know the Egyptians held the Israelites out on the eastern side, on the eastern slopes, didn't want to mix with them too much, and so they maintained a lot of their culture, which was in fact Sumerian and with a bit of Canaanite, and also in bringing that culture and being where they were relative to Egyptian culture, we'll look at next week. As I think we've said before, the alphabet develops as a very nice hybrid between Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics or Doric. So that all kind of comes together. So I've always looked at this as a very good thing, not that Moses stole these stories, but in fact, when writing came along, when an alphabet came along, in which you could fully express these stories, what we see is the stories as God gave them to Moses. And what we'll see there is the outcomes and the attitudes of the gods and the people are very, very different. But like the culture in which we live today, which seems like something new is being invented, or at least transformed or hacked or disrupted. That's the right word. That's the big word today, right? The Sumerians really changed things up. The basis of everything being mathematics. They were a very mathematical people. They were, that's where all their writing comes from. They wanted a receipt, right? They wanted to file their taxes. They didn't want someone coming along and say, you owe this much. It's like, no, I don't. Their identity was very independent. And that was, if you were king and I was not, don't come to me for second taxes or we might have a problem. So they were very independent, and they're all through their system of laws. It was all based on, really, do you have a receipt for that? Do you have a record of that? Do you have my signature on that contract? And so their courts were really the core of their identity. And it made them, unlike us today, of course, very litigious, right? And it made them very much about their own rights, my rights. I did this, I said that. And like the Greeks and Romans that would come along after them, and many cultures in between, glory and honor were really great things. Now, from a Jewish concept, Judeo-Christian concept, glory and honor, or glory and honor for God. In everyone else's concept is glory and honor for me, because I know I'm going to die. And when I die, I don't want to ever be forgotten, because where I'm going in their concept of heaven and hell is a bad place. And even if it's the nice side of the bad place, the point is it's where you're forgotten. And so they never wanted to be forgotten. And the core of that is leaving a record. And their mathematics becomes the writing. It becomes cuneiform, which all they need is clay and reeds and a bit of water, and they got that, right? So that even their letters look like someone just cut a reed. So all their letters have little triangles, because that's what a reed looks like when you slice it. Does that translate to like goose feathers in our writing? I'm not sure. But they also invented the big thing, and giving them full credit for this is only if you give the Ararat2s, make the Ararat2s Sumerian, which they did become. But that hydraulic engineering we talked about last week is really important. How to take water away from where you don't want it, how to put water where you do want it is key to farming. It's key to a dry basement. It's key to power that you can generate, and so on. And so, especially in a land that floods a lot, that's a big one. The chariot, these aren't quite in the order they should be. The chariot comes out of the potter's wheel, but the fact that they're able to create both domesticate animals and at the same time use that wheel thing they were using to make pots to carry people and equipment and supplies is pretty dramatic. They invent the plow, which for them was actually a pretty simple invention. It just made all the sense in the world. You just needed something hard enough to cut through that ground when pulled by a couple of oxen, again, which they domesticated for the purpose, but I'm sure they were using it when it was just people on the other end of that rope. Textile mills. So they're the one that, remember how beautiful that outfit was on that lady from last week standing at the ziggurat? I mean, that looked like she'd been on the catwalk. I mean, it's amazing. And that's the capabilities they had with the dyes, with the fabrics, not just their own fabrics like linen, right, that would come from flax, but cotton, wool, I mean, you name it, whatever. I don't believe they had silk. There's no record of that. That would come a bit later, and everyone would fall in love with silk, of course. But they were able to mass produce clothing, garments, at least the bolts, if you will, that people at home could turn into their own garments as well. They mass produced bricks, as we saw in the city of Eridu, right? They all look the same. They set standards for bricks. Nobody makes bricks this big by this big. They make them all this big by this big. So by mass producing bricks, it meant that you could build buildings with reliable physics because all the bricks were baked to the same degree. They were all of the same size, and it let you know how you were going to build, especially things that were tall. Metallurgy came, even though they had not any metal in their whole area, metals came to them with all the food they sold, and people will trade metals for food. Good to know. But they immediately took on that because what did they have? They had kilns, right? And so you throw the copper in the kiln, watch what happens to it. It's like, hey, that's the same thing that makes those beautiful pots is enough to turn that copper into liquid. If it's in liquid, then I can turn it into fill in the blank. And they would actually push into the Bronze Age in their time, because some of the copper might not be too pure. Some of the copper they're getting from the Caspian Sea, from areas in Israel, is going to be polluted with arsenic, not so good for the metal workers, and tin. And yet that polluted copper is going to end up being bronze. And it's so much harder. And so that's going to allow them to use the kilns that they developed for out of bricks, right? A kiln is made of bricks. What do you use a kiln for? To bake bricks, right? So they turned that into kilns for metal. They figured out things like charcoal and ways to get it on bellows to make the fires hotter. And it took them from working with gold and silver, which are very soft, into being able to work with fire on harder metals. They never quite got casting. The Chinese did that. That gives you the real mass production. But basically, they could still work everything with hammers. The fast pottery wheel for the truly lazy people, but that allowed them then to set up pottery factories. So just like we have, I think we still have them, don't we, down along Route 30? They wouldn't be pottery anymore. They were to make the dishes and such. I remember there were some makers along Route 30 back in the day, but they're the first ones to get that going, and were able to crank out new fashions, new styles, new capabilities, new sizes that, again, fed the trade around the world in their sailboats. So they were able to make the right kind of items to carry, the different liquids, the different solids, and so on, in their sailboats to far off lands, as well as bringing new stuff in. And pack animals, of course. And pack animals were probably quite early. But the donkey is number one. And then from the donkey, we move to the oxen. And then basically from there, it goes out into many of the animals that we're aware of today. And those animals also came to them via the sailboats. I want to take a look at Sumerian mathematics here, because we said it's the beginning of everything. And again, this looks like someone broke a reed, basically. 1, 2, 3. All right, that's a good place to start, right? But what we get into then is values into greater and greater numbers with different symbols, and we'll see how it develops. So we get to the point where we've got symbols both early and then late, when they're first invented, and then when you needed to write them down really fast. Think of this as like the cursive, right, or the typewriter version, to get into numbers again along that space 60 curve. But they went further than that. They were able to develop symbols for fractions. So if I have, so if I want to say, what's my 1/2, right? That's a 1. That's a 1. So I just turn the one on side and put it here. Hence, how do we do fractions? 1 over, right? That line used to be the number under consideration. So they're able to do fractions. That really helps with measurements. But we have to ask ourselves about base 60, right? That seems weird, doesn't it? After reading about this, I thought, why didn't we ever give that up? All right, we count. How do we learn to count? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. As soon as I count over 5, I have to put my pen down, right? Because I need the other hand. And I might even have to kick off my shoes, right? So if you're doing simple counting, when we look at this, that's 5, right? No, that's 12. Especially if I'm using my left hand, because you've got joints. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And I don't count anything in the thumb because that's how I'm counting while I'm writing with the other hand. I read that, but that's brilliant. Why did we not do that? I mean, we've looked at our hands our whole lives and said 5. Like, not even close. And so if you think about it, 5 5s, right? And so that's how we get to base 60. So we go from, or rather 5 12s. 5 12s take us to 60. And then from there, basically we can add zeros, if you will. So that is their entire counting system. So I looked at that and thought, these people are so smart. Somewhere along the way, we lost it. Devolved. Maybe it was aliens. But you see, they're able to bring these symbols together to make very complex numbers. They figure out multiplication tables. Every child, I mean, we find children's multiplication tables. You know, Tommy, did you read your clay scrap today? You know? So that's actually happening, and they're doing mixed operations too. And they even develop their own ability to do complex mathematics. So not only fractions, but they're able to do, again, in base 60, algebra, and then eventually trigonometry. That's still a little controversial. Everybody wants to give kind of the Babylonians or even the Europeans credit for that. And it is in base 60. But the way they developed angles fit the kind of building that they were doing. When we got into building the way we build in more modern times, the trigonometry made no sense in the way that the Sumerians did it. But they were definitely, they or the Babylonians were definitely first. And then from there, the Sumerian calendar, and again, it's 12 seasons, 12 months rather. And of course, what the name of the month is, it's not January, it's shovel the snow and scrape the car. That's what month it is, right? And it's not April, it's get your butt out there and plant. Right? And so literally the names of the months tell you what you should be doing, right? And so every time you turn the calendar page, it's like, I should be doing that, shouldn't I? And so, and I kind of reduced it a little bit so it would fit, but there's more things. It's like, do this, and then you can rest, and then do this, and do this. So they even planned when you can take some days off. But they built that all into their calendars, and then they associated festivals. So you got the month, what you're supposed to be doing, the festival, and then what day the festival starts. So again, very efficient. People who are always looking for a way to do it faster. Then from this, they develop their system of writing, cuneiform. And as you can see, it does develop over time, and it starts very pictographic, like the Egyptian, and then it becomes more and more abstract. To me, it doesn't look like you could make that symbol faster than that symbol, but apparently with a reed, you can. So very simple things. Star will eventually become God and heaven. Earth doesn't quite look like Earth to me, but that will become a symbol for Earth. Man and women are pretty self-explanatory. And then this becomes mountains. You know, it had a numeric meaning as well, but once we start turning it to make it easier to write, and they literally did that. If they had a letter that was more up and down and they wanted to go left to right or right to left, they would just turn it sideways because it's easier to write that way, right? Again, they're always thinking about how to make it better. And they just combine the symbols to make them, give them multiple meanings. So a guy from the mountains, right? Mountain guy. And mountain guy would become eventually redneck. No, I'm serious. No, I'm not kidding. That's what it meant. Because the Gutians were considered unsophisticated yokels who were always a pain in the neck, stealing from us and attacking us. And of course, that's how they looked at them. So, and you reacted exactly like I hoped. Thank you very much for that. Sumerian measurement then also developed measures of length, which, and we've got the eventual Hebrew versions of that. But so measures of length, measures of capacity, both wet and dry, and then of course measurements of weight. And they set very specific weights for their scales. You can actually get them today. You can see them in a museum, a whole set of weights, and they would make the stone a very specific size. I didn't want to throw any more pictures in here, but if you looked up Sumerian weights, you'd see what looks like a very standardized version. So their scales measured right. The religion is interesting, and their scripture, because today we look at polytheistic religions and we see them as more, with the exception of Hinduism, we see them as less sophisticated. We see history going from polytheistic tribal gods to more monotheistic, and most of the world's people actually live in that world today. And even the pagans would not consider their monotheistic version would be more of I'm the god. So for the modern pagan. But the Sumerian religion was very interesting, and then it was polytheistic, up to 1,000 deities in the pantheon. I had a slide and I took it out that literally showed all the relationships between all the gods. And it goes end to end of all the different names and all they do, and when you call them, and it's quite something. The gods, the big gods, Enki, Anu, Nabu, and Muaddi, and also Inanna, Inanna is in particular. The goddesses, there she is, Inanna, Nerzaring, and you'll find when we talk about how the cities fought each other, they fought each other largely over religion. And it was all about the temple of Inanna. Well, I'm almost afraid to say what that would be in our world for get myself in trouble. But there are, as we said, many parallel stories to the Hebrew scriptures. And they also had good pictures. They had their own stained glass windows, if you will. So the story of Noah, the story of, I'm not sure if this is Job or Bel, the other guy, but all their scriptural stories were all recorded, and they had a fairly common but expansive storybook of what all of their religious heroes had done. But religion was not something that brought them together. If you remember at Abu Hurairah, right, and well, Gobekli Tepe, right, our first week, there religion brought people together. People who didn't have anything permanent. People came to share what they had. They had extra. They all got together. They built a beautiful outdoor temple and they feasted together. By the time we get to Sumer, society's become incredibly sophisticated, but human nature has turned them all against each other. And largely what they're killing each other for is who gets Inanna's temple. And literally, who's ever got the temple is the Washington, D.C. That's where the capital is, who's ever got the temple. And it literally starts between two very famous cities. The oldest writing we have from these folks that's a story and not just numbers is one city king saying to another city king, I want to do some trade, and then, oh, I want you to give me the trade with me for the materials necessary to build a temple, because I want to build the temple of Inanna. And it's like the temple of Inanna is here. My soldiers say different. And so there was no like, I'll help you build your own temple of Inanna. No, there's only one temple of Inanna. And it's in Lagash, or it's in Ur, or it's over here, or it's over there. And there's only one. And we know who's ever got it is in charge. And yet in charge doesn't mean anything. It's like your rival. It's like you won the Super Bowl and you get to be the Super Bowl team until someone else wins the Super Bowl, except the Super Bowl's fought with weapons and chariots, unfortunately. So it became that kind of rivalry. It wasn't to determine who would run everything. It's to determine who was the most important one, but you can go on and keep doing your own thing. But these cities were absolutely stunning, as you can see. This is the Sumerian city of Uruk, and we name a whole period of the Sumerian Empire. And again, I could do weeks and weeks. I could do a whole 10 weeks on Sumer. But if you look at the cities and the sophistication, the bridges that actually have staircases off them, the size of the buildings, the sailboats at sea, the fields that surround them, there's so much going on here. There's factories here. There's hospitals of a kind. There's a very busy port. There's all kinds of administrative officials. And of course, the church is right there in the middle of town, right? The temple, that would have been the temple of Inanna at this particular point. But it is massive. And at the same time, it's all about their pride, right? Their position. But that's the city today. Now, the fact that it survived from 3800 BC till now is pretty remarkable, which goes to show you, the quality of the building they could do. But in the end, right, it all goes back to dust. The Sumerian city of Mari comes a little bit later, and it is just so stunningly beautiful. I mean, round, what a great idea. And a city within a city, the close fields, the distant fields, right on the major river. The river literally bisects the town, although not quite down the middle. An amazing feat. And this is it. This was it in 2018 before the IS folks started ripping it apart to sell to collectors. So it's not quite in that shape. It's been looted again in modern days. But as you can see, for all their pride, for all their civilization, for all their accomplishments, in the end, it all goes back to dust. And as we look at what that means from a government standpoint, all these wonderful cities could have been part of the same country or the same world. Instead, you can see the names repeated again, right? Uruk has it. No, Uruk has it. No, we've got it. No, Ur has it. No, Ur gets it back. And basically, it keeps going back and forth, warring to have the goddess's temple, to be the number one, to be the Super Bowl champ. And so they never coalesce into a national identity, even though they speak the same language, they wear the same clothing, they have the same technology, they trade with the same nations, but in the end, they can't get along with each other, even enough to have a kind of a sister city world. And if that's not a parallel for today's world, I don't know what is. So should I identify some of these as the red cities and the blue cities? But that's literally what we're talking about here. So in post-history, what happens is they're able to hold it together for quite a while. Depending on who you're reading, 1500 to 2000 years, maybe a little bit longer. But finally, the people from the north, right, the Canadians, if you will, they say, we actually can get it together. We face harder struggles up north here. And we don't just help our local neighbor, we might help the people in the next town. We might work together to make things happen. And a guy comes along named Sargon I, whose story sounds a lot like Moses. He's hidden in a basket, floated down a river to keep him safe from the angry king who wants him dead. But he speaks a different language. He speaks Akkadian, so that's Semitic. That would be all of the Semitic languages in the Middle East, including Hebrew, would be that. What the Sumerians' language, in addition to everything else they did, completely disappeared. We can't trace their language to any other language on earth. So maybe that was the language of Babel, right? Because it is gone. And it's taken a century to put it back together, even a little, because we can't say, oh, that's kind of just like Persian. No, that's just kind of like the Russian. No, it's like there's nothing that is like the Sumerian language, and it is absolutely erased. But fortunately, they wrote a lot down, and we've been kind of rediscovering it. So when the Akkadian influence comes down, we literally have people just getting together, people cooperating together under the leadership of Sargon. And so the Sumerian language fades out. Think of it like the Susquehanna River. Susquehanna is not an English word, but it's a Pennsylvania river. The people who gave it that name, they don't exist anymore as a people, if you will. So that's basically what happened to Sumer. Even though it was the most sophisticated city of its time, the most sophisticated world of its time, a civilization and such, it was just erased. And from that then, even though Sargon had brought everybody together, nobody lives forever, and his son and grandson did not do as good a job. And so we see 2004, think Abram about 2000 BC, a few years closer or further away. And so Ur 3, the last Ur of the Chaldeans, it is gone. And then it'll take a man called Hammurabi to come back with a Semitic culture and move the capital to Babylon, which is more defensible, and found the Babylonian Empire. That's actually Sargon down in the corner. And then basically what's going to happen is these Akkadian dynasties that do a good job of being a national conglomerate eventually fall again, and they're either destroyed or abandoned or just brought into Babylonian. But as we look then at the end, as we bring it all around and we make the parallels, what we'll see is that the God of the Hebrews, the God of Christianity, our God, is always portrayed as eternal, just, unchanging, and loving. Whereas Enki and Inanna are capricious, they're hateful, they're weak. That's where you're going to get Zeus and Hera out of. That's where you're going to get the Roman Jove and the Roman gods. So they go two very different directions. So when we talk about, when the critics talk about Hebrew and the Hebrew God and religious beliefs coming out of Sumer, we see that they really couldn't be any more different. Their gods are far more like people than the God we know and love. And the Old Testament afterlife is waiting for resurrection, waiting for the reward. The Sumerian afterlife is dark and full of regret, so you better party now. You better achieve anything you're going to achieve now. You better get your name remembered now. And for all they did to remember their names, their kingdoms are dust. as we look at the people they mention, Noah accepts God's command and preaches repentance, even though no one takes him up on it. Ziusudra argues with his God constantly and helps nobody. Job fights for justice and accepts testing. His Sumerian parallel just whines and cries. The biblical figures choose to serve God all their days, and the Sumerian heroes are all focused on their own immortality. How many likes they get, right? How many followers they have. That's the world we kind of live in today. So when we look at Sumer and we look at all they accomplished and their shining achievements, it doesn't hurt to look at our world and go, well, what's that? You know, what's New York City going to look like? What's Moscow? What's Paris? What's London going to look like? You know, in the time to come, because nothing humans do is immortal. Everything we do, it only has any chance to survive into eternity if we do it for God. And so that's where the Sumerians, who got everything almost right, completely lost it when it came to how they looked at God and how they looked at themselves in relation to God. But next week, we go to the kingdom of Egypt, which got a lot closer to our belief set than the Sumerians ever did. And Abraham had a lot of interaction, because we know Moses, but Abraham did, as well as being a Canaanite warlord. And this is how these pyramids originally looked. They were covered in white limestone, and the very tops were gold. And you could see them from miles and miles away. And the rivers ran right up to them. And we're going to look at all that they were able to create of stone in their world, and how they moved one step closer to understanding God for who he is, thanks to the patriarchs. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time. I ran a little over this time, so I can only take questions after I stop recording for those who can stay. I swear they moved. Stop.